Hello and welcome, everyone. This is a podcast with Steve Keen. I've been looking forward to doing this. Steve and I have known each other for some time, over a decade, and I've been reading his work for longer than that. Many viewers of this channel will know Steve's work and have probably been watching his own channel, where he puts out a lot of really good material. But this is a chance for the two of us to talk to each other, talk about where we've arrived in the world, how we've arrived in the world. And I hope it's going to be the beginning of a number of discussions between the two of us, which are going to lead on into things like his program called RAVEL, how he developed it and why, and things like that. But first of all, let me just give you a little background on Steve for those who are not familiar with him. A professional economist, he always has been, an Australian of origin. He did his first and second degrees at the University of Sydney, and then I think moved on to the University of New South Wales to do his master's and PhD. So long history of academic study there, but became an associate professor of economics at the University of Western Sydney and stayed there until around 2013, Steve.
I actually became professor by the time I left, mate. This is one of
Well, okay.
This proves that I don't edit my own Wikipedia profile, unlike some
It
neoclassical
probably
economists I know.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah, my own Wikipedia profile is amazing. It even puts me in the wrong place in terms of where I live.
Yeah.
So I deliberately leave it that way because then I know where people got the information from.
Mm.
And then in 2014, you moved to the UK,
Yep.
became head of economics, history and politics at Houston University. But you're now an honorary professor at UCL and a distinguished research fellow there. But really, let's come down to why I know of your work.
Mhm.
You are a very notable heterodox economist, challenging the assumptions which most people comply with. Your most notable book, and it's up on those shelves behind me, is Debunking Economics.
Mhm.
I remember reading that way before I ever thought we'd meet each other and thinking, God, this guy's a geek in the best possible way that I can imagine. And I really like the way he thinks and works and talks and explains just why standard classical, neoclassical, neoliberal economic thinking is wrong. And that really is, I guess, the point to begin to start our conversation. You have taken on the world. Tell me, Steve, why are you a rebel?
It's an interesting story. I mean, if I probably go back a bit because I've had a couple of recent fights which remind me of some of my past behaviours as well. And one thing I really have been in my bonnet about illogical thought. If somebody says A causes B, therefore B does not, and B causes C, therefore C is not caused by A. I say, hang on a second, you've made a logical error. That's always been a standout of my personal behaviour. So that's just part of my characteristic. If I see something which looks, one proposition appears illogical to another, then I dive in, and that's where I turn to that ultra geek you're talking about from debunking. And the reason that I became a critic of economics was a bit of background. I was intending to be a physicist, and my interest in school was physics. So I had 6 years of a hopeless Morris brother physics teacher or science teacher. And then I had a brilliant economics teacher in year 11. So I turned from physics to economics. And then I got to university and I was a complete believer in what we now call neoclassical economics without knowing that that's what it was, of course. When you're a school student,
Yep.
You think it's just economics you're learning, not a particular paradigm within economics. And I was a complete convert to the belief that you should have free markets, efficiency, equilibrium, yada, yada, yada. And then the Sydney University, I had no idea when I arrived, had been in turmoil for about 3 years before I arrived because a group of very conservative economists, professors, were appointed above a quite heterodox department at the time, as we call it heterodox now. It wasn't known as that then, with quite a strong humanist history to them. And suddenly this neoclassical paradigm was imposed in 1968. I copped it in 1971 when I went to university. And they just appointed a new lecturer from not from which university he came from, I could look it up, Frank Stilwell. And Frank had himself become a critic. He'd done a PhD. And in the middle of the PhD, I think, he himself started to see through the theory. So when he gave his first year lectures, and he was a brilliant lecturer, his first year lectures, he covered an issue called the theory of the second best. Now, this is something which has sort of had its day in economic theory, but I think it won a Nobel Prize initially for what its developers, Lancaster, and I've forgotten the other. I think it's Lipsey and Lancaster. I'm not sure about Lipsey, but it's definitely Lancaster. And what they said is that the standard economic theory says that the best possible situation is perfect competition everywhere. So you have, if you want to get a wage, the decent wage, you want workers to get what they deserve, then what you want to have is workers competing against each other for employment and firms competing against each other to hire workers, and no unions and no industrial organisations on the management side. But of course, that's the real world. We do have trade unions, we do have industrial associations. So what the theory of the second best did in Frank's hands was he said, well, let's take the standard theory of how the wage is set, and you get a downward sloping demand curve, which comes from the employers, upward sloping supply curve, which comes from the workers. Point of intersection is equilibrium. That's the best possible situation. You get no what they call dead weight loss of welfare, maximum possible utility for both sides. That's your ideal. But if you start, if you bring in a monopoly, and most people would be aware of this, if you bring in a monopoly, that gives you another line called the marginal revenue curve as opposed to the demand curve, and that will give you a lower wage and a lower level of employment. If you put in then, the same thing applies on the supply curve. If you have a unions rather than disaggregated workers, you get what's called marginal social product curve. Using straight neoclassical techniques and presuming equilibrium and so on, that theory showed that if you abolish either the trade union or the industrial organisation without abolishing the other, you make social welfare worse. And I remember, pardon the French, what the fuck? What I've learned, the conventional theory, everything's perfect, hunky-dory, that's the ideal we're aiming to. And if you're 2 steps from it and you take 1 step towards it, you make the system worse. I thought, this is crazy. There's got to be something wrong with the theory. So I opened up my textbook. Is this theory mentioned in my first year economics textbook? Not at all. I went down to the university library and I found the articles that Frank was basing his work on. At this stage, I was doing first year of pure and applied mathematics, so it was a breeze for me to read the mathematics. So there's nothing in most neoclassical work that exceeds a first year mathematics degree in terms of mathematical nous to read it. Frank was completely correct. So why wasn't this turning up on the textbooks? And then I continued going, and I thought I'll read the Economic Journal. That was my idea of the top journal at the time. And I found an article by a Marxist, Baduri. Surprised. What's a Marxist doing in the Economic Journal? That was a bit of a surprise, because all I heard about Marxism was all the negative stuff at this stage, of course. And then I found
Marxists were definitely in the Economic Journal at the time, Steve.
Yeah.
They definitely were.
They were. They turned up. Yeah, turned up in Economic Journal, but they did. We know no way they'd do it today, including people like me will never turn up in the Economic Journal. But then I found an article by Paul Samuelson. And in this article by Samuelson, written in 1966, he conceded defeat. He was defending the orthodoxy.
Right.
And then he had a debate over the nature of the measurement of capital. And he was quite confident that he had solved the problem. He said what we teach students is a parable, but the parable reflects the fact that there are fixed ratios of labour to capital in each technology, but as the price system changes, as the interest rates rise or the cost of capital rise, you lose less capital and more labour, vice versa. You get a nice smooth function out of this and it all works well. Well, that paper he wrote was then attacked by a guy called Garignani, and he showed that you didn't get straight lines, you got curves, and this leads to a technical thing called re-switching. That was a hell of a shock to Samuelson. He was blown out of the water by another mathematical economist. So this is the conclusion he wrote to this paper. He said, pathology illuminates healthy physiology. He says the critics merit our gratitude for demonstrating that re-switching is a logical possibility. Then he goes to say there often turns to be no unambiguous way of characterising different processes as more capital intensive, more mechanised, more roundabout. And he finally says, and this is the final sentence, if all this causes headaches for those nostalgic for the old-time parables of neoclassical writing, we must remind ourselves that scholars are not born to live an easy existence. We must respect and appraise the facts of life. And I thought, bravo.
Indeed.
Bravo. What has he written in his textbook, which I had a copy of? Not a mention. And neoclassicals
Absolutely
today
not.
think they won that debate, So I realised I was getting a mendacious education. Whether the economists who are doing that were aware of it or not, most of them just don't know this literature. They basically think they won all the controversies. Krugman has said that, and he's categorically wrong. So what I found was economics, it's superficial treatment of economics. Supply and demand, intersecting supply and demand. Bob's your uncle, intersection where everything happened. Let's go on to the next theorem, But if you then say, what's the backstory to the shape of the demand curve? What's the backstory to the supply curve? You drill down and find that both of those backstories failed. And for example, the supply curve, the theory for the supply curve is that there's diminishing marginal productivity. You add more workers to a fixed amount of machinery, you get less output per worker, even though the workers are identical in quality, yada, yada, yada. And that then gives you rising marginal cost. But when empirical studies were done, there are 71 empirical studies that have been done. 71 of them have found the majority of firms have declining marginal cost. They don't experience diminishing marginal productivity at all. And it's not just a few firms, it's between 89 and 99% of firms report constant or falling marginal cost, depending on the survey. So I thought, the textbooks are teaching a lie. So that's why I became a rebel.
So
I didn't enjoy being lied to. Yep.
If I get to a point here, Steve, and I sort of recognize your journey. Obviously, we didn't know each other at the time. I was 5 years behind you going to university. I arrived at university and was told at the time that there was this thing, perfect competition. There was perfect information. Everybody knew what the product was.
Exactly.
It was a uniform product. Everybody was bidding for the same product. They knew all the suppliers. They knew all their prices. Therefore, there would be an optimal outcome and all that sort of nonsense.
Yep.
And I'd had the advantage of before I went to university, doing some accounting.
Right. Yeah.
And I had seen small businesses. And I turned up at university knowing darn well that they did not know what their optimal pricing was. They did not know what their marginal costs were. They'd never thought about it. They did not know what their marginal revenues were. They'd never thought about it.
Yep.
But they did know how to strike a deal. And that was the best thing that you could say was they did a deal. And at that stage in life, if this is in the 1970s, I'm quite sure quite a lot of them were putting a fair amount of cash in their back pocket because there wasn't much way to catch them back then. But the point I'm making is that I arrived at the same point in my career, realizing, hang on, everything I'm being taught here is rubbish.
Yep.
First year undergraduate economics. We had that same realization. I think that's really interesting that at the same points in our career, we realized that this whole edifice that we were being taught was underpinned by a series of assumptions. And if any one of those assumptions failed, and you've just explained a way in which they can fail. And I found other ways in which I thought they'd failed from a different route, practical experience in a sense.
Yep.
I wasn't as academic as you at that stage, Steve. I wasn't going off to read the papers to prove the point, but you were. I used my real world view and came to the same conclusion. We were being taught nonsense.
Exactly.
And I think that's where, but as a rebel, that's where you were born, wasn't it?
Exactly.
What happened next?
I became a rebel. So when I began university, I swallowed the whole thing. I was anti-trade union. This actually is almost automatic for being a neoclassical economist. You regard trade unions as distorting the competitive job market, and therefore they should be abolished. And the amount of pressure that economists have put on to destroy trade unions over the last 50 years is huge, and they've been successful. But it's not supported. It's supported by the superficial level of the theory, where you make all those crazy assumptions. Yeah. When you say those assumptions are crazy, then you get the results like I got logically out of the theory of the second best, and like you got by saying, look, I haven't seen a firm that even knows its marginal cost. It becomes, you realize this is a con job. Why on earth are economists basing themselves on theories which are empirically false and assumptions which are empirically false?
50 years later, Steve.
Yeah.
50 years later. This isn't to our credit. They're still teaching that nonsense to students now.
I know. It's because, and this is what I realized when I broke away. I went from being anti-trade union to the first thing I did when I got a part-time job at the end of first year was joining up to the trade union. Okay? So I realized they were there to protect workers, and it was part of the bargaining power of workers in what is actually a bargaining contest. It's not something about bloody marginal productivity. So it was a complete political conversion. And at the same time, I've got to say that there were political circumstances in Australia that made me more likely to be a rebel. So I went to university in 1971. Australia was still involved in the Vietnam War at the time. I supported the Vietnam War, but I wondered why I was being conscripted to fight for freedom. So as well as attacking the neoclassical theory, I started reading as much as I could on the history of Vietnam. And I finally realized that what was going on in Vietnam was a war, anti-colonial war, in which America and Australia were fighting on the wrong side. And so that
Yep.
also completely flipped my political views. I met people from the Palestinian movement at the time. So there's so many ways in which my worldview was flipped in 1971. And then from that point on, having been a rebel initially, I was just dissatisfied by what I was being taught. And then I found that I wasn't the only one. There was about half the staff were up in arms about what had been done to them by changing the curriculum and anti the neoclassical analysis. And so I became friends with the staff, and I finally organised, I think in 1972 or the beginning of 1973, I organised a conference on radical economics. Yeah. So, and if I do say so myself, it was an extremely badly organised conference that was a waste of time. Okay, I learned a lot about conferences by running a bad one initially. One of my favourite sayings is that success is the first step on the ladder of failure and vice versa. So having a failure early on, I damn well knew how to run conferences after that, and I run several extremely good ones. But that one was very poor. But nonetheless, there was other students who turned up, and we found ourselves chatting about how frustrated we were by what we were being taught and the intransigence of the professors about it. And then I finally gave up. I thought I'm just I'm a weirdo. I'm on the side of people like Frank and Gavin Butler and Evan Jones and the staff who are anti the professors. But there was no chance of changing the rest of the students. And then 72, Australia pulled out of the Vietnam War at the very end. That's why I didn't become a draft resistor. Formally, I was one technically, but I didn't have to run away from the police as a result, because by the time I would have been arrested for resisting the draft, the draft that ended in South Australia's involvement in the war.
Right.
And all this energy that students had to fight the Vietnam War was suddenly being directed at what they were being taught. And it wasn't just in economics, it was in Italian. The very first strike in students at Sydney University was in the architecture department in 1972, I think, or early 73, yeah. So
That's a
it was
weird place to start.
it was a wonderful time to be a student, I must say, because 71 to 73 were the absolute peak of the post-war boom. And so we all basically thought we couldn't fail to get a job, so we can do what we want.
I remember that feeling.
Universities were free, so you didn't have to pay fees. You went to learn rather than getting credentialism. You thought a credential was not a problem. So it was a really fantastic time to be an active student. And the trigger for change at Sydney University, which then triggered what I've done in economics since, was two young PhD students in the Department of Philosophy, Liz Jacker and Anne Curthoys, wanted to put a course on what they called philosophical aspects of feminist thought. So the department was democratically run at the time, and they voted in favour of the course. But the professor, a guy called Anderson, was an old-fashioned philosopher, and he opposed it. And the vice-chancellor, Bruce Williams, who was an economist from Manchester University, UK, he supported Anderson. And finally, this philosophy staff said, we want a general strike. So in 1973, something out of 17,000 students at the university, I think ultimately 8,000 were on strike. Quite a remarkable time. And then that triggered in economics. We had our own meeting about wanting to change economics. And much to my amazement, the bunch of students that I thought were apathetic were in favour of a day of protest over what we were being taught. So we organised the day of protest. We shut down the standard lectures. We didn't shut them down. We just basically said, don't turn up. We gave our own lectures at the time. It was a huge, and that led to the dispute arguing for the creation of the Department of Political Economy. Now, I've got my own problems about what political economy turned into. It's more political science than economics these days, in my opinion. But that change, that battle with the professors, led to me ultimately becoming a professor myself and saying I've got to take them on at the source of their ideas, which is how economic theory is developed. And that's, that dates me right back to 18 years old.
So where did you go in your PhD? Because you looked at Marx in your PhD.
No, I looked at Marx in my master's thesis. So this is a bit of
Sorry,
background.
wrong one.
I'm a contrarian of contrarians, and this is like my first response was seeing through neoclassical economic theory. And then at the end of the 1973, when there'd been successful strikes in all these departments and education was changed progressively in each of those departments, the bunch of lefties got together. And what a bunch of lefties do, they decide to read Karl. Okay, so we had a Karl Marx reading group. And this was in December of 1973. Now, you know that Sydney is pretty good weather. Okay, this was a marvelous
Yes.
summer. We spent the bloody summer in a cold sandstone building in the middle of the main quadrangle at Sydney University, reading Karl Marx. And I remember
What
walking
did
to.
I say earlier,
So,
Steve? What
so
did I say
I'm a
earlier about
nerd,
you?
yeah.
What did I say earlier?
No argument there. It's taken me a long time to come to terms with that. I'm also a jock. I was in the weightlifting
Okay.
club at Sydney University. I held the state record for bench pressing and in powerlifting. And I could have turned professional tennis player. So but I was short. I never thought of myself as a jock because I'm too small. Okay, but at those days, I was ridiculously athletic as well. Anyway, I remember walking to the meeting to read Marx, and Sydney University is on a bit of a hill, and it actually overlooks the whole of the Sydney CBD to some extent. And the whole CBD was covered in what are called kangaroo cranes. If you know the cranes that have got the long straight bars, they're an Australian
Oh, right.
invention.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're an Australian
Right.
invention. And everywhere you look, there was kangaroo cranes. There was a huge construction boom. And I was walking across with a fellow law student because I was doing arts law at the time, and noticed them and he said, I want a very good explanation from Marx as to why those things don't add value. So I then read Das Kapital looking for Marx's explanation as to why labour is a source of value, as Marx claimed, and not capital. And I found a brilliant philosophical explanation of Marx's theory of value, which involved, rather than saying marginal utility and marginal cost and they're equal, which is the neoclassical approach, Marx said
Uh-huh.
utility and exchange value are incommensurable. They're different. And he said if you imagine that the utility of the buyer and the seller are part of the sale process, then you're imagining a primitive economy trading with another primitive economy where one economy makes something the other one doesn't. And like you'll see these glass beads and think how fabulous the glass beads are. I must give away the island I'm on to get the glass beads, that sort of thing. The utility does affect. So Marx said in the primitive state of society, yes, the utility of the buyer and the seller is part of the transaction because the seller has to give away something they can get utility from to get something they get more utility back from. So utility will play a role in that calculation. But he said once you get established systems of trade, both sides start producing excess of those two commodities for trade so that there's stuff specifically traded for the purpose of trade. You're not giving away something you can
Yeah.
use yourself. You're giving away something you produce specifically for exchange. He said in that world, the exchange value becomes disconnected from use value. And therefore said he said they're incommensurable. So use value is fundamentally qualitative, exchange value is fundamentally quantitative. And I thought this is a brilliant alternative to the neoclassical argument. But he then said, when you apply it to production, a capitalist must find a commodity which is a source of more value than it contains. And he said the worker is paid their exchange value, which is their means of subsistence. What the buyer capitalist exploits is their use value, which is their capacity to produce commodities for exchange. They're incommensurable, but they're both quantitative. And Marx literally uses the word quantitative, magnitudes. So they're different magnitudes, and that's the explanation for the source of surplus. I thought that was brilliant, and it
I,
also applies equally to machinery. So machinery you pay its cost of production, you get its capacity to produce goods for output. They're incommensurable, they'll be different. Machinery can be a source of value as well. Now, that went down like a lead balloon with my fellow Marxist readers. And I then did my master's thesis, finding where Marx came up with an argument, and I found where he actually contradicted the labour theory of value. That was my master's thesis. So I was on a good footing, yeah. So I think annoyed neoclassicals, next thing I annoyed Marxists, and my God, I seem to be annoying some MMTers these days as well.
so let's move to that.
Yeah.
You've come a long way. And Debunking Economics was, in a sense, pivotal to your recognition internationally
Yeah.
because of the way in which you actually laid out these ideas that the underpinning of neoclassical and neoliberal economics just don't work. I mean, the maths is just literally absurd that
It
they
is,
use.
yeah.
It just doesn't back up. I mean, I'm not being impolite to them to say that. It just is totally illogical maths.
Yep.
It isn't even really maths at all. It's just a set of assumptions which are
I
so
call
artificial.
it mathematics. Okay. And
Yeah,
Assad
that's quite a
Zaman,
good one, actually. I like that.
well, there's an Assad
Because that's
Zaman.
what it is.
Assad Zaman is a good friend of mine, a Pakistani non-orthodox economist. He came up with mathemagics. So I think
Yeah, okay, that'll do as well.
so mythmagic, that's
You
what
know,
they practice.
all these supposed proofs, all those papers that they start off with, let's assume the standard assumptions of neoclassical
Yep.
economics. In other words, the world is perfect. So why are we bothering to do anything else, was always my question. If the world's perfect, why are we trying to
Yeah,
actually
exactly.
why try change it, guys? I'm already in bliss. This is it, the best I'll ever be.
Well, in fact,
it's why I never accepted the concept of equilibrium, because I always thought, nah, there's got to be something better than this.
Exactly. See, what has actually happened, and this is why they're so dangerous, is that humans have a tendency to want to have an ideal system. Okay? We've got this belief in perfect systems are part of our belief. We'll explain that the king is king because he's the son of God, et cetera, et cetera. We all want to justify situations. Well, when you look at neoclassical theory, what it says is capitalism is the best of all possible social systems. And what happens is people who swallow that stuff and they think it's all logically grounded become zealots for their vision of capitalism. Now, it's got nothing to do with existing capitalism, but that zealotry explains a huge part of their behavior and why they're immune to logical and empirical contradictions.
I mean, that is going back to literally where I was back in 1976. I've seen the real world of business. I'm very young, but I've seen some real businesses, and I've seen what economists say, and the two do not coincide with each other.
Totally
and
not.
Nothing has ever persuaded in me in all the years that have elapsed since then that actually economists are even trying to explain the real world out there. And all their prescriptions are just totally artificial in that sense.
Yeah.
Where are you now, Steve? We could talk all day. We know we can talk all day.
Definitely could.
We have done it, and we're going to talk again very soon. But where now? Where has the rebel got to? What's your current obsession, desire, geek, whatever it might be?
It sounds like Lucifer. Well, the fundamental thing I want to be working on is attacking economists on climate change. That's what I want to be doing, because economists have completely trivialised the dangers we face. And my next book, which I'm writing for Polity Press, and the massive delays in writing it for various reasons, the working title of that is How Economists Will Destroy Capitalism. So that's what I want to be working on. Because of my personal situations and the state of politics, I'm largely working on things like how does government financing work? Because we have, again, neoclassical mythical views about the government that are what constrain government behaviour, that mean we haven't built anything like the resources we need to both have educated, civilised societies and also to combat climate change. So my preferred area of work would be attacking them on climate change and pointing out just how dangerous they are and how close we are to catastrophe. Thanks to them, we did nothing for the last half century. But also to do that, I've got to explain how government finances work, because the people who swallowed, without knowing they've swallowed it, they've done a PPE course, 1 year of economics, and they become chancellor. They're the ones who are doing the damage, because they're saying we can't afford it when, as you and I both know, the government creates money when it spends. It's got the power. It is not constrained by its budget. And because of that false belief, we've reduced the quality of education, we've reduced the quality of health, we've reduced the quality of welfare, as if that's going to make the world a better place. And of course, it's making the world a worse place.
Listeners to this channel will have heard me say very many similar things on many occasions.
Yeah.
We are at a point on that where, and let's be honest, I also do work on climate change. I have promoted ideas around accounting change there, whereas you're promoting economic changes, but they obviously coincide. But there's another point that we had in common, that we are both, in a sense, believers in what modern monetary theory says about the way in which money is created. You just said it. Governments create money. We both know that. We believe that's true. It's those who say otherwise in economics, I think, are like geographers who still swear that the world is flat. It's absurd.
Absolutely. I call neoclassicals Ptolemaic economists these days. It's a more accurate description. Though, of course, it's an insult to Ptolemy because at least the Ptolemaics predict where the planets were going to be fairly accurately.
Okay, that's pretty fair. But also, they're not even Newtonian yet in physics terms, let alone recognizing there might be quantum. They're
Absolutely.
so far away from reality. But you just hinted that you don't agree with everything in MMT. I want to pick up that point. This is our first conversation. We're going to have others. And the best thing about this conversation is I want to leave more questions unanswered than answered. What is your problem with some of MMT? Because that's an issue which is definitely going to be of interest to people on this channel.
Yeah, well, the fundamental point is their theory of trade. Because their theory of government money creation comes out of Warren Mosler's observation that the government doesn't tax to spend, it spends to tax. And that was like a one-liner, but you can then put that into accounting framework, which of course I've invented with RAVEL, and it's 100%.
We'll talk about it soon. Talk about it soon.
I know.
I promise you.
Okay, so that's one side. The other side is their trade comes out of another one-liner from Warren, which is exports are a cost, imports are a benefit. I argue that one contradicts the other. When you put the two in a double inventory terms, you get one argues that the government should run a deficit, which creates net financial resources for the private sector. And the other argues that the country should run a trade deficit, which actually destroys net financial assets for the private sector.
Yes.
And they haven't realized that contradiction. And so I just want to, I didn't want to attack that because my attitude basically was they're completely right about government spending. That's a huge contribution on that front. I'd agree to Warren getting the Nobel Prize for it. Yeah. Not that he will, but it's valid, it's huge valid contribution. But on the other one, I didn't worry about it so much because I thought, well, what global warming is going to do to any country that can't produce its own goods in the meantime will swamp anything about trade. Any country that isn't largely self-sufficient is going to be destroyed when climate change comes along. So I can treat the other part as a secondary issue. But some events have happened in the MMT circle that basically provoked me to saying what I think about that second one. And what I'm doing over time, I won't be doing it in a hurry because it's going to take quite a while to build. But I've worked out how to critique not just the MMT attitude on trade, but comparative advantage as well, which is the neoclassical attitude on trade. And a lot of MMTs
which
think
also needs to be.
Sorry? Yeah.
I mean, comparative advantage needs to be deconstructed.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the question is,
a completely absurd notion in its own right.
And it's
in fact, I'm going to be doing. Yeah. I'm going to be doing some discussions on this channel about the history of economic thought over the next few weeks, months. And of course, comparative advantage is one of the things we're going to be talking about. But fundamentally, the assumptions yet again are, well, they were flawed at the time, but to pretend that they have any relevance today is just completely absurd. I agree with you, by the way. I entirely disagree with Warren's observations on trade.
Yep,
they make absolutely no sense in accounting terms. They make no sense in economic terms. I cannot see where he's getting to. I don't buy it. And I don't think we're alone in the MMT and community in thinking that. But there is a certain feeling in the MMT community that if Warren said it, it's got to be right and there's not too much questioning. And I guess that's the point that I'm going to reach, because we've been talking for over half an hour now, and I tend to like to keep these to half an hour-ish or so. You've not been frightened to challenge people.
No.
If there's one thing I'd say about you, that's definitely what you've done. If there's an opportunity to get on a soapbox and say, but you're wrong, and this is the reason why you're wrong, because you don't just say you're wrong, you actually work out why they're wrong. That's what's characterized your career. Is that fair?
Yeah, I'm never willing just to say I disagree. Okay, I've got to show why I disagree, and that ends up getting involved in mathematical proofs and empirical data as well. So, and we desperately need that because economics has the pretense of science. It's scientism, not science, and we need to replace it with. If we can't make it a science like the physical sciences, you don't have the same conservation laws and so on that apply there. But we can make it a lot more scientific in how it behaves. And that applies not just to neoclassicals, but to Marxists and MMTs at the same time. And what I've found is all three will defend their turf in terms of making rejecting anybody who criticizes the underlying assumptions or criticizes the analysis. So that makes me an enemy of a large part of economics. That's why, like in post-Keynesian terms, the most people who call themselves post-Keynesians got there for the same reason that you and I became critics, because they think, I'm sick of these crazy assumptions, I want some realism. So overall, the post-Keynesian school has got much, much greater foundation in realism, and there's more willingness, more ability of post-Keynes to say, oh, I got that wrong, sorry, I'll change the theory. Whereas if neoclassical say, oh, we got the diminishing marginal productivity wrong, if they change it, the whole damn thing falls apart, and they can't do it. So you get this, resistance to change and improvement. And I hate to say it, but I'm seeing the same in the MMT mob. That on the trade, there are, 99% of the contribution is valuable, and that's on the government spending. The 1% is the stuff on trade, which is contradictory, and I'm going to prove it, but it's going to take me about a year to write the proof.
Okay, Steve, we've arrived at the point where, first of all, you've opened up an opportunity for a second discussion between us.
Mm-hmm.
And that is your discussion about data there. And I really want to have a conversation next about why you have become a convert to double entry bookkeeping.
Yep.
Hallelujah, I say. But then it's my 50th anniversary this year of first coming across the discipline, which I find quite extraordinary. How can I have been doing debits and credits for 50 years? And secondly, data, of course. So thank you for this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
We've had a discussion. It's an opening shot in what I hope will be a series of discussions. It's been great to talk to you. We will be back again very soon. We're going to talk about double entry, accounting, economics, and your software, RAVEL. So thanks a lot, Steve. Much appreciate your time.
Ditto, mate, definitely.